Today, we are going to be having a presentation titled Anti-Semitism in the Archives, Responses to Prejudice in Colorado and Texas with Dr. Joshua Furman. I'm going to give him a little bit of an introduction too before I hand it over. Dr. Joshua Furman is the Gene Abrams Endowed Director of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society at the University of Denver. He serves there as an affiliate faculty member for the Center of Judaic Studies. Prior to joining DU in 2024, Dr. Furman worked at Rice University from 2015 to 2023, where he served as the Associate Director for the program in Jewish Studies and the founder and first curator of the Joan in Stanford Alexander South Texas Jewish Archives. He has received grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Council on Liberty and Information Resources, the Southern Jewish Historical Society, and several other foundations. His work focuses on the experiences of American Jews in the Jewish communities between the East and West Coasts, principally Colorado and Texas. Dr. Furman's recent publications examine Jewish immigrants to the United States through Galveston, Texas in the years before World War I and the evolution of the Jewish neighborhoods in
All right.
Houston.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that introduction. So, as you mentioned, I'm relatively new to Denver. I came to Colorado and to DU a little over a year ago. Um, and I'm excited to be with you today. I am a native Texan. I did my undergraduate degree at Northwestern in Chicago, so I'm no stranger to winter cold and snow. And my doctorate in Jewish history is from the University of Maryland. I did previously work at Rice University for about 8 years, and I'm excited to be working and teaching at the University of Denver now, and doing my part with all of you to preserve Jewish history in Denver, in Colorado, and in the Rocky Mountain West. Let me just briefly say a few words about my organization, the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society. I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with it, but just in case, if you haven't heard of us before, this is an organization that was established in 1976, and we're housed at DU. We are part of the Center for Judaic Studies. We work to preserve and publicize Jewish history in Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West. We partner with the Beck Archives at DU to encourage research and education around Colorado Jewish history. And we are extremely active in the community. We sponsor lectures, tours, exhibits, a book club, and other programs. Earlier this past year, we took a trip to Leadville, Colorado to visit the historic synagogue, cemetery, and museum there. And I don't have a date yet, but we're planning a trip to Trinidad next fall to visit Temple Aaron, which I'm very excited about. We also started a book club, which meets quarterly every 3 months. Our last meeting was just a few weeks ago at the Golda Meir House Museum. We read a biography of Henrietta Zold, the woman who, among many other accomplishments, founded Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization. And we had a tour of the Golda Meir House Museum, and we were able to compare and contrast the lives and philosophies of two really important Zionist female leaders. And we have two upcoming programs. Another program on anti-Semitism. I'll be in conversation with Professor Britt Tevis of Syracuse University on Tuesday, February 25th. And then our annual lecture in American Jewish History, our Livingston and Abrams lecture, will be held Tuesday, April 1st at the Wolf Theater at the Denver JCC. And we're very excited to bring a really cool podcast team, Galit and Danielle Dardashti, who created The Nightingale of Iran, which is an award-winning audio documentary about a Jewish family from Iran and their journey to the United States. So get in touch with me for more information about all of those programs. And again, I hope I'll have a chance to meet and get to know you in person. But it's a little bit too cold today. So I wish we had a happier, more uplifting topic. You know, it's kind of a cold, dreary weather day, and I wish we were doing something a little bit more, um, fun or light. But there's no denying that the topic of anti-Semitism in American life is one that I'm sure all of us, certainly myself included, have been paying much more attention to in the last couple of years, and certainly since October 7th. And in the field of American Jewish history, I think that, there are often um, impulses to think about America as an exceptional home and refuge for Jews. And I think that has been true and still true. But what that assertion often ignores is the fact that as much as America has been a safe haven for Jews around the world, since the colonial period, and we'll go back in time for a few minutes and actually see some of these instances, Jews have faced discrimination and exclusion in American life really since the very beginning. And that's what today's talk is going to look at. So, where does anti Semitism on American soil really come from? In order to contextualize it, we really have to go back to medieval Europe. And a lot of the stereotypes about Jewish people that predominate in American life, even today, can be traced back to medieval Christian Europe. The idea that Jews are primitive, greedy, stubborn, conniving, clannish. If you read Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice in high school or college, you probably recall that the central villain of that story is the merchant Shylock, who fits all of those stereotypes and is very much a tragic figure. So really kind of, central in Western culture, these stereotypes about Jews have a very long history. And literally from the very beginning, from the first time that a group of 23 Jewish refugees landed in North America in 1654, fleeing the Inquisition in Brazil, which had just been captured by the Portuguese. The Dutch governor of New Amsterdam tried to get them expelled. He tried to have them deported, and his justification was, quote, that the members of this deceitful race should not infect and trouble the good people of New Amsterdam. Luckily, Stuyvesant's decree was overturned. Jews were allowed to stay in America and eventually to establish communities. But from the very beginning, it was kind of tenuous and uncertain as to whether or not Jews would be able to establish a foothold in what would become the United States. Fast forward to the Civil War. This is an episode that you may or may not be familiar with. But Ulysses S. Grant, later president, but at this time the general and the head of the Union Army, actually passed an order expelling Jews from the territory of the Confederacy that the Union Army had controlled. This was a territory that included Kentucky and Tennessee, parts of Mississippi. At the time, in the middle of the war between the Union and the Confederacy, smuggling and black market profiteering were a serious problem. There was a small handful of Jews who were involved in this practice, but in response, Grant decided that every single Jewish man, woman, and child would be expelled from the territory. And again, feeding on stereotypes of Jews as being dishonest, traitorous, greedy, and disloyal. We come then to the 20th century, and probably the most infamous episode of American anti-Semitism that there is, the lynching of Leo Frank in Atlanta in 1915. So for those of you unfamiliar with this episode, in 1913 in Atlanta, a young teenage girl named Mary Fagan very tragically was found dead in the cellar of the pencil factory where she worked. The police arrested and interviewed many suspects, but they ultimately centered their efforts on Leo Frank, who happened to be Jewish, who was not from Atlanta originally. Of course, he was not only an immigrant, he was not even a Southerner. And so he became a prime convenient suspect for the police, who were under significant pressure to solve this case and to identify a suspect. Interestingly, it was a black janitor's testimony that was the prime evidence in convicting Frank, even though this same janitor himself had been a suspect. So Frank was sentenced to death on the basis of that testimony. The governor, facing some pressure from Jewish advocacy organizations decided to commute the sentence to life in prison instead of a capital sentence. This didn't sit too well with the people in Georgia, and a mob um, notoriously seized Leo Frank from prison and actually lynched him. And again, we see some of these same stereotypes. Jews as predatory, abusive, even dangerous, even willing and able to commit murder. Interestingly, the Leo Frank episode acted in two ways in American history. On the one hand, it led to the creation of the Anti-Defamation League, an organization we'll be talking about in a few minutes, to combat similar instances of anti-Jewish discrimination and accusation. At the same time, it would lead to a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, an organization dedicated to, in its views, um, purifying and saving America from African Americans and from immigrants. So certainly a very painful and difficult episode in American history and in American Jewish history, but one that has cast a long shadow. And then we come now, kind of as I look to sort of wrap up the introduction to my remarks today, to the 21st century, which has been not only not really better in terms of the prevalence of anti-Semitism as a factor in American life, but decidedly worse. And we could look back at the Unite the Right rally, which took place in Charlottesville in 2017, the senseless and tragic murder of Jews attending synagogue in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018. Somebody who's been in the news a little bit this week, Kanye West, who has continued to make hateful and derogatory comments about Jews in public and on social media. And now there's a AI deepfake video of Jewish celebrities wearing like anti-Kanye t-shirts, which has surfaced just in the last 48 hours, which you may have seen. And not too long ago, while I was still living in Texas, and it seems like, only 3 years ago, but it's faded from memory. I would imagine for a lot of us, there was a terrible hostage situation at a synagogue outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth area in January of 2022, where the rabbi and some congregants were held hostage for several hours before, luckily, they were rescued. And then, of course, it goes without saying the pervasive anti-Semitism that we have seen after October 7th, 2023, both on college campuses and in the general public at large. And the Anti-Defamation League's 2024 report bears out, sadly, a lot of this information in the form of statistics. The number of documented episodes of anti-Semitism tripled in 2024 from the previous year, more than 10,000 cases ranging from vandalism to harassment to assault, and you can see some of the numbers here. My colleague Deborah Lipstadt, who has taught at Emory University for decades and is a leading Holocaust scholar and who has been formerly the U.S. Special Envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism, wrote a book about 5 years ago looking at anti-Semitism in historical perspective. And one of the insights that she shares in that book that I found very meaningful is that, it's important to have empirical evidence. And I think the statistics, on the one hand, they give a certain weight and gravity to the problem of anti-Semitism that we face in our society. But she argues that, we shouldn't get bogged down in statistics, right? In the counting of incidents, because ultimately, at the end of the day, anti-Semitism, she argues, is a worldview problem. It's not a statistical problem. And here's something that she says in this book. What should alarm us is that human beings continue to believe in a conspiracy that demonizes Jews and sees them as responsible for evil. The historical consequences of this nefarious passion have been so disastrous that to ignore its contemporary manifestations would be irresponsible. And this begs the question, well, if anti-Semitism is a worldview problem, but if it only involves Jews, then why should anybody outside the Jewish community care or be concerned? And to that question, she has, I think, a really insightful answer. And what she says is this: the existence of prejudice in any of its forms is a threat to all those who value an inclusive, democratic, and multicultural society. Anti-Semitism flourishes in a society that is intolerant of others, be they immigrants or racial and religious minorities. When expressions of contempt for one group become normative, it is virtually inevitable that similar hatred will be directed at other groups. So, what Lipstadt is arguing here is that anti Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. If we live in a society that tolerates and allows for hatred of one minority to thrive and flourish, then that opens the floodgates for hatred of other groups or minorities to do the same. And so that's why it's a concerning problem that reverberates well beyond the Jewish community. So, what I'd like to do today with the rest of our time together is to look a little bit more locally using the archival resources that I curated in my previous role as the director of the South Texas Jewish Archives at Rice University in Houston, and that working with my partner David Fassman at DU today. David is the curator of the Beck Archives. I'm the director of the Historical Society. See how anti-Semitism has played out locally in Texas and Colorado, and to sort of see what these common threads uh, are when we look at episodes of anti-Semitism. Again, not in New York, not on the East Coast, but a little bit closer to home, and to see what, if anything, we can learn from it. So the first topic that I chose for my talk today has to do with the Ku Klux Klan. And one of the things that I was really interested to know, or to learn rather, when I moved to Colorado, um, is that Colorado in the 1920s was absolutely a hotbed and a stronghold of Klan activity. And we'll get to more of that in a few minutes. I think it's important to begin, though, by talking about the history of the Klan. We won't be looking so much at its third chapter, right, in the 1950s and 1960s, but as a kind of prequel to the 1920s, it's important to go back and learn about how this organization got started. So, in the aftermath of the Civil War in Tennessee in 1866, a group of veterans got together, upset about the advances in civil rights, upset about, the end of slavery and the decline of, the Old South, what they called the Lost Cause, began violently terrorizing blacks and supporters of Reconstruction. This group was disbanded by the 1870s, but kind of remained in the shadows as a group that many people believed that their objectives were worthy of support. And then you had possibly the most influential film ever made, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which debuted in 1915 and portrayed this group of Civil War veterans, which called itself the Ku Klux Klan, um, as as heroes, as defenders of white women, of white purity, of democracy. And the film literally re-energized the Ku Klux Klan, which was sort of reborn now as a secret society with its own rituals, oaths, ranks, of course, the famous, white robe costumes. Um, Now, interestingly, the 1915 version of the Ku Klux Klan, in addition, of course, to hating African Americans, they also targeted Jews and Catholics who they saw to be enemies of what they believed was the American way of life. And you can see here, this is a Ku Klux Klan cartoon from the 1920s in which the strong arm of the KKK is literally yanking the Jew and the Catholic, and the Jew is associated in the mind of the Klan with money, with the influence of culture, corrupting movies, and decent fashions, whereas Catholics try to dominate American society through politics and through their own separate parochial schools. So at its peak in 1924, the Klan claimed 4.5 million members, 200,000 in Texas, and more than 35,000 here in Colorado. It's true that because Jews were sometimes seen as white, depending on the situation, they largely escaped the worst of the brunt of the Klan's hatred and violence. But in at least two cases, Jewish Texans were beaten and terrorized. And we'll talk in a minute about what happened in Colorado. So this man, Hiram Wesley Evans, born in Alabama but grew up in Texas and was its imperial wizard from 1922 until 1939. And here he is on the cover of Time magazine in 1924. And he gave a speech in which he called Jews an absolutely unblendable element in American life. And he said, yes, Jews are law-abiding, they're intelligent, and they're moral, but they lack true patriotic feeling for America, and they cling to their separate traditions. And in the speech, he said, their homes are not American, but Jewish homes, into which we cannot go, and from which they will never emerge for a real intermingling with America. So in the mind of Evans and his fellow Klansmen, again, who numbered in the millions nationwide, Jews might not be bad people, but at their core, they're inherently un-American. They're inherently different. They don't really belong here. And there's no conceivable future for him, for Evans, in which Jews can become American and can contribute to society in a meaningful way. And so Jews will always be outsiders and outcasts in the opinion of the Ku Klux Klan. And here they are. This is a sort of famous picture that appeared in the Denver Post in 1926. This is a Klan march, right? Not in the dead of night, but in broad daylight down Larimer Street. And you can see crowds gathered to watch, and the line of Klansmen, goes on for blocks, and blocks right here in Denver, Colorado. So as in Texas and elsewhere, the Klan rose to power here in the 1920s. And they had basically at their core three elements to their platform, right? Fighting crime and vice, diminishing the influence of immigrants, meaning Jews, but also Italian Catholics, and resisting, of course, racial integration. And at History Colorado, they actually have the membership ledgers for the Denver KKK. It includes more than 30,000 names. And again, elected officials, judges, people from all professions and walks of life. This was not something that attracted, only the lower classes or the working classes. Quite the opposite. There was at least one episode of anti-Semitic violence that I'm made aware of, in which a Jewish attorney by the name of Ben Laska was actually seized and beaten in January of 1924. Ben Stapleton, a name that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and a name that was in the news just in the last couple of years, was elected mayor of Denver. And in order to win his election in 1923, he was not shy or regretful about attracting the support of the Klan, but publicly he sort of made statements that indicated that he might distance himself from the Klan. We do know that he was a card-holding member of the Klan, and he did, once elected, elevate other Klan members into various levels of city government, but he drew the line apparently at the chief of police position. So a number of anti-Klan Denverites, furious at this, actually launched a recall campaign. And at that point, Stapleton, in order to protect himself against recall pressure, turns even more into the arms of the Klan. And he gets a pro-Klan chief of police, a guy named William Candlish, to make sure that he'll have Klan votes in this recall election. And one of his biggest, loudest foes in this political battle is a Jewish attorney named Philip Hornbein. Hornbein was born in New York, but came to Denver when he was just an infant. He's a graduate of DU Law School from 1901, so we're very proud to claim him here at DU. Very active in Democratic Party politics, and actually defended the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News from libel charges that were brought by then former Governor Clarence Morley, who was also, by the way, a Klan supporter. On a bit of a lighter note, we have in the Beck Archives at DU a collection of Hornbein family papers and photographs, and this is sort of a cute posed family picture of them on vacation in San Francisco. His daughter Marjorie was for many years a very dedicated supporter and board member of the Rocky Mountain Jewish Historical Society. So anytime I have a chance to remember and honor the Hornbein family, I'm always sure to do that. So Hornbein was not at all shy about taking Mayor Stapleton to task, publishing public statements in the newspaper, asking Denverites if they wanted a government aligned with the Klan or not. And here's something that he said in one of his speeches. The obligation of a public official is utterly inconsistent with any allegiance to a secret political organization that is capitalized on religious bigotry or prejudice. No man can serve two masters. A public official cannot serve the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the Ku Klux Klan. He cannot serve all the people of the city and county who contribute to the government and at the same time bestow special consideration upon his fellow Klansmen. There cannot be a government of the people and for the people and by the people, and a government for the Klan, by the Klan, and of the Klan. So, unfortunately, Stapleton survives the recall. He cruises to victory with the support of the Klan. The only coalition of Denverites that really stood in Stapleton's way were the West Colfax Jewish precincts. And even the Denver Post had to acknowledge after the recall election that the Klan was the largest, most cohesive, and most efficiently organized political force in the state of Colorado today. And as the news of Stapleton's win spread, Klan members actually burned crosses to celebrate on top of South Table Mountain, visible from Denver. I want to just briefly address, and I see that there are some comments in the chat. So when I finish my remarks about the Klan, maybe I'll pop out and we can look at some of those before we change topics. And feel free, by the way, to post comments or questions in the chat as we continue. So Texas, of course, had a much larger Klan presence. And there was a newspaper actually published in Houston called Colonel Mayfield's Weekly. And you can see here the headline, it's the Ku Klux Klan versus Jew, Jug, and Jesuit. I'm a fan of alliteration, I have to say, KKK and JJJ, although the message is quite detestable. But you can see here, right, who the Klan identified as their enemies. Jews, Jesuits, right, meaning Catholics, and the jug, right, alcohol. This was the era of Prohibition. And Catholics and Jews were associated in the public mind within the Klan with alcohol, right, with bootlegging, with excessive drinking, and alcohol, of course, being a gateway to the kind of social, cultural, and political corruption that they associated with Jews. And he published an article, I'm not going to read it out loud, but you can kind of see it here on the screen, in which Colonel Mayfield's Weekly accused the Jews in 1923 of basically taking control of all American industries, from the motion picture industry to medicine to advertising to boxing. And we've all heard, I'm sure, these accusations that Jews control the media, that they control the banks, that they control big business. This is from 1923. This is more than 100 years ago. And he concludes by saying they're barely 3.33% of the population, and yet they control nearly every big industry in the country. So far out of proportion to their numbers, Jews, according to this accusation, right, have uncontrolled and unchecked power. Unless you think it was just this one sort of whack job newspaper in Texas that was spouting this kind of filth. We can look no further than Henry Ford and his Dearborn Independent newspaper, which regularly published headlines such as "The International Jew, the World's Problem," for exactly this same kind of rhetoric. So I want to end the first half of my talk on something of a positive note. So we've seen how Jews and Catholics were the prime targets of the 1920s Klan. So at least in one case, in Galveston, Texas, Catholic and Jewish religious leaders in town formed an alliance to actually fight back against the Klan. And not only did they speak out in public to challenge the Klan and to contest these ideas, they actually got city officials to deny parade permits to the Klan. Think about that parade picture from Larimer Street that we saw a few minutes ago. So that was shut down in Galveston. They got Birth of a Nation, that pro-Klan movie, pulled from a local movie theater. And because they were able to work together, so Galveston's Klan chapter never really gained a foothold. So what happened to the Klan in the 1920s? So here in Colorado, it turned out that the leader of the Colorado Klan, a guy named John Galen Locke, turned out he was not so forthright and law-abiding, got convicted of tax evasion. And as the state organization started to fall apart and get into legal trouble, Stapleton distanced himself. In Texas, the Klan went down to electoral defeat in 1924 and 1926. And I think to some extent, this story indicates the power of interfaith alliances. It is worth noting, though, that even though African Americans were also targets of the Klan, that Jews tended not in this period to ally themselves with them. In the 1950s and 60s, however, they would, but that's a period beyond the scope of this talk. And of course, here in Denver, there have been a lot of discussions in the last decade about the Stapleton name in Denver. And as I'm sure many of you know, neighborhoods were changed, and the Stapleton, I forget if which neighborhood used to be Stapleton and what it's called now. But there was a significant effort given Stapleton's past association with the Klan to remove his name from Denver neighborhoods, landmarks, businesses, and other things. All right. Let me go ahead and I'm going to step out of the presentation for a moment so that we can see what's happening in the chat. So Central Park, thank you, Liz. Central Park is the new name of the neighborhood formerly known as Stapleton. There's a comment about a great-grandson of Stapleton's that you can see in the chat. Yes, Marjorie Hornbein was a prolific Colorado Jewish historian, and we do have several copies of her History of Temple Emmanuel in the Beck Archives and in my office. And of course, there's a new updated history of Temple Emmanuel that was just published in honor of the temple's 150th anniversary. So feel free, go ahead and keep the comments and questions coming. This is great. I'm going to change gears now, and we're going to talk about another aspect of anti-Semitism, which is a little bit less direct than Klansmen parading through downtown or burning crosses. And that's the phenomenon of social exclusion. And I'm going to take you now to a place that you likely haven't heard of. It's a small town in Texas called Wharton. And Wharton here refers not to the UPenn Business School, which is how most people know Wharton, but to a small town just about 60 miles outside of Houston where I used to live. So in many ways, Wharton is no different than any other small town where Jews came and settled in the middle to late decades of the 19th century. And before long, there was a synagogue chartered in 1913 called Shereth Israel. There was at one time a Shereth Israel here in Denver also. Jews predominated in the retail sector in Wharton. I did several interviews with Jewish people who grew up in Wharton who told me that you literally could not buy a suit in Wharton, Texas on Rosh Hashanah because all the clothing stores were Jewish owned, and of course they would all close down. This is a history that's rapidly disappearing, but when I visited Wharton back in 2019, you could still see in photographs some of the original Jewish names that were inscribed on mosaic tile in front of the Jewish stores in the main town square. There are no Jews today left living in Wharton, which is why documenting this history is so important. Here's a photo from the congregation Shereth Israel there. And they had their big event was an annual barbecue. They would invite the whole town, Jews and Christians, and everybody would get together. And we have a T-shirt in the archives at Rice. I survived the Shereth Israel barbecue from Wharton, Texas. But as much as on the surface, Jews were welcomed in Wharton and able to establish a synagogue and able to, do well economically, socially there were still barriers and aspects of Wharton life that were closed to them. And one of them famously was the country club. So here are the bylaws from the Wharton, Texas Country Club. And we're going to look at how, without explicitly saying that Jews can't join the club, the bylaws worked to make Jewish exclusion a practice. So Article 3, Section 1 of the bylaws stated, active membership shall be open to any resident of Wharton County over 21 years of age, of good moral character, acceptable to the board of directors. So what you'll notice is that it doesn't use the word Jew, it doesn't use the word black. But what it does say is good moral character. So good moral character is a very elastic, subjective phrase. What does it mean to be of good moral character? Well, good moral character is one of the codes used here for Christian. Okay? If you're not a Christian, if you're not a good church-going Whartonian, right, then, well, that might be grounds for excluding you. And you have to be acceptable to the board of directors. So what that does is it gives wide leeway to the members of the board of directors to decide who is and who is not acceptable to them. So without explicitly excluding members of any group, they've implicitly set some boundaries here in the bylaws that gives them grounds for excluding people that they don't like, including Jews and African Americans. But it goes beyond that. Here's Article 5, Sections 1 and 2. Each applicant shall be proposed and recommended by at least 2 active members. The names, residences, and occupations of the applicants proposed for membership, with the names of the members proposing and recommending them, shall be posted upon the bulletin board of the club at least 2 weeks before being acted upon by the board of directors. So, how else did the Wharton Country Club work to exclude Jews from membership? So, you had to be nominated by at least 2 people. So, if one member of the country club thought it was okay for a Jewish person to be nominated, that wasn't enough. You had to get a second. There had to be at least 2 members willing to do that. Then, assuming you cleared that hurdle, your name, where you lived, and your occupation were posted on a bulletin board along with the names of the people recommending you. What's interesting about that? Well, Jews, particularly at this time, tended to, tended to specialize in certain occupations. And we could go on for a long time about why Jews in this era, right, the 1940s, tended to predominate in retail. But it was a known fact that if you owned a dry goods store or a clothing store in Wharton at that time, right, you were Jewish. So even if your last name or first name didn't give away that you were Jewish, based on your occupation, it might have been a dead giveaway. And any member who might have thought it was, maybe it's time to challenge the unwritten rule that we don't nominate Jews, right, had to be willing to associate their name, had to be willing to risk their own reputation to nominate a Jewish person. And here actually is a letter of protest written by Edward Littman to the Wharton Country Club Board of Directors. Now it's 1953. And Littman, in this letter, says that, he's interested in discussing the question of the non-membership of Jewish residents of Wharton in your club. It's a known fact that Jews in Wharton can't join the club. And he writes, when I first came to Wharton last year, I was not only surprised, but stunned to find this condition existing here, particularly since I left Germany for racial reasons and fought the war as an American enlisted man and officer for 4 years to eliminate persecution and prejudice. So here's somebody who left Nazi Germany because he was Jewish, fought for America in World War II in order to, combat and defeat prejudice, and comes to Wharton to find that anti-Semitism is alive and well. So how could that be? And interestingly, Mr. Littman saved the response that he got from one of the board members of the club, in which the board member effectively says, I am, shocked. And, we've known about this and we're grateful for you, for writing it. And then in the middle paragraph on your screen, you'll see he repeats the line from the bylaws. Membership in the club is open to any resident of good moral character acceptable to the board who's sponsored by 2 members. And then he says something that everybody knows to be false. No person of the Jewish faith has ever been turned down or refused membership by the board of directors. And no one of Jewish faith or blood, that's an interesting phrase, no one of Jewish faith or blood will be turned down or refuse membership in the Wharton Country Club simply for the reason that they are Jewish. So a kind of like, well, we know it's a problem, but also we swear up and down at the Wharton Country Club that we've never done this. We've never openly or explicitly or intentionally tried to exclude Jews. And I interviewed, we don't have time to listen to it, but I interviewed somebody who grew up in Wharton, and it was a known fact in the Jewish community that Jews couldn't join the club until the 1960s, when the club was starting to shrink and they needed new members, they needed financial support, and they started to turn to the Jewish community. And one of the things that Mr. Wadler told me is that the Wharton Jewish community, not surprisingly, was very split. Should they join the club because, as good citizens of Wharton, it was something that they wanted to do? Or should they not honor the Wharton Country Club, which denied them access for so many decades, by now, deciding to join it? And so they kind of split, interestingly, on that question. And what this episode at the Wharton Country, and by the way, this is an episode that repeated itself in cities and towns across America in the 20th century and into more recent times, where Jews were not welcome in elite neighborhoods and educational institutions and social institutions. And here are two examples from Denver that I pulled from the Rocky Mountain News. Um, the first is a job ad. The second is